It's a pleasure to be here. This is joint work with colleagues at the Bank of Italy. And usual disclaimer applies. So let me start motivating the work of tracking high frequency economic activity in Italy, mainly at the weekly frequency, via this graph. So this graph shows you the all the recession, the length, the recessionary path in Italy, all the recessionary path in Italy from the 60s till 2020 Q2, and basically you can see that COVID-19 was an extraordinary recession for its depth, for its depth, and for its gradient that was incredibly strong with respect to all the other recessions that hit Italy. And so this created a huge challenge in nowcasting economic activity during COVID times. In fact, at the beginning of the at the early stage of the pandemics, basically we didn't have data. It was very difficult to grasp the duration and the geographical extension of the crisis. Plus, it was very difficult to infer the economic impact of lockdown measures because basically we didn't have that. We didn't have data. We didn't have previous data on pandemics on such a big and worldwide pandemic. So like time series, traditional time series model were of limited use. Plus, also because like the pandemic was such a convolution of supply and demand shock that the past movement of the variables were not of much help. So what did we do? Basically, we married the great idea of Luis Mertens, Stock and Trivedi, 2021, who proposed a methodology, a very simple methodology, basically a principal component of data that are commonly used, that are commonly present in the nowcasting toolbox of I'm from a central bank, so from Central Bank of Italy. So these variables are in the nowcasting tool of all central banks, but basically they had the great idea of look at them more frequently. So not use this high frequency variable at the monthly, at the quarterly level, but basically to look at them via a model very frequently. So inspired from their work, we initially built a classical equivalent based on classical statistics, classical PCA called ET-way. And now in this presentation, I'm adding a little bit of, I'm adding the B, the Bayesian, since we think, with the other co-authors, we think that Bayesian shrinkage can help in shaping the signal of economic activity even better. So we have the advantage of the shrinkage, and we can make stochastic probabilistic statement, like what is the probability that the economic activity will be below X% for the next 3 months. So let me be really brief here because I already said most of these things before. Let me put in compare and contrast what do we do with respect to what Luis, Mertens and Trivedi did. Basically, we compare with their contribution, that is for coming on a journal Applied Econometrics, we add the Bayesian. We think that Bayesian can have a kick. We use a mixed frequency dataset, but this is because in US there is a richness of there are much more high frequency indicators that are all available at the weekly frequency. So we use a mixed frequency model because we use a combination of monthly and weekly time series. And we want to track economic activity as they do, but we also want to push the idea that this index is not only good to track economic activity, but also for nowcasting. In fact, I'll show you in the next slides that it has good in-sample and out-of-sample performance, and that it can give a timely, reliable signal 1 month before the exit of Italian GDP flash release. All in all, while they look at US, we look at Italy. So very fast on the literature, we want to contribute to the literature on high frequency trackers of economic activity, and we take some. Since we use payment data, because at the Bank of Italy we have a long enough tradition of 6-7 years of using payment data for nowcasting. We take from this tradition, and then we use Bayesian techniques for the estimation of the model. Here is the data. So, as I told you before, we use a mixed frequency data set of 13 series, 5 weekly and 8 monthly. The first 5 weekly time series are available at a daily frequency, but we want to use a weekly frequency because it has for the noisy. The daily frequency is a beautiful frequency, but it's really noisy. So we go weekly. As you can see, debit card expenditure, credit card expenditure, electricity consumption, gas pipeline to the industrial section, and a Google trend index that signal shortage in the labor market, namely the number of time that people on Google Trends in Italy look for the short-term time work scheme. As you can see, the monthly variables are traditional, are in everyday Nowcaster toolbox, so like traffic flows, some other index of consumer expenditure, purchasing manager indexes of manufacturing and services, and then the actual subsidies to workers in Italy. So, given the information set, what do we do with this series? Basically, we for the weekly series, we take out the high frequency seasonal components via two methodologies, and the one is clear regression, and the other one is an observed component model proposed by Professor Proietti in a paper in 2016. And once we strip out the seasonal pattern for the weekly seasonal series, basically we take this transformation that basically transform all the variable in Q-on-Q growth rates. Let me also tell you that while Stock, Mertens, and Lewis use their indicator can be read as a weekly economic index that is comparable with year-on-year GDP growth rates. We do all this machinery following the work of colleagues Abuba, Erslan, and Goetz 2021 to have our index in a unit of measure that is handy for our purposes, namely that is expressed in quarter-on-quarter GDP growth rate. That is how we measure in Europe growth rates, basically. So this is what we do to the transformation we make on the weekly variables. The monthly variable are not standard. So let me show you what this transformation gives for the total consumption of electricity in Italy in green, gas pipeline for industrial sector, and volume of motorway traffic. Here we take only cargos, so only not automobile, not cars, not family cars. Basically, only cargo that brings goods around Italy. So as you can see, first there is strong commonality, and this is why we want to use a Bayesian version of principal component. Strong commonality, and then you can also see how it tracks well the huge fall in during the pandemic and the huge rebound that follow in 2020 Q3. These slides summarize the estimation, as I told you, we have a mixed frequency data set. So to fill the missing data and to deal with the radiage problem, since data are updated irregularly, they come in an irregular manner, we use EM algorithm a la Stock and Watson 2002 in order to fill the gaps. And once we have filled the gaps, we use state space method. Basically, what we find is that this Bayesian ET way, that is the first latent common factor of the 13 series, that is rescaled with a regression with the Italian GDP Concu growth rate, does a good job both in tracking economic activity and in nowcasting, both in sample and out of sample. Let me skip the detail on the industrial production. Let me show you the index on the whole sample. The index started in 2010, in July 2010, and we are updating continuously at the bank. At the moment, we don't publish it, but we are updating it continuously. Here, the index arrives till March 2021, and basically hope you can see in blue you find the median of the index. In light and in light blue and a little bit more dark blue, you find the confidence interval. The black line is the our previous indicator, the one the one estimated with classical methods, with PCA basically, and you can see that it's much more volatile. It has higher variance. It's an estimator with higher variance. So, like here, you see the benefit of putting the shrinkage, and the red line are the GDP release. Let me zoom for the COVID period. Here is when basically COVID started in Italy. Before we had a normal activity, and then the situation deteriorated and then rebounded in Q3. The most important thing of the indicator, you see, is that the most important values are the one close when the quarter is closing. So basically, as information accrues, the index becomes more and more precise. Here is each dot is 1 week passing. You can see that before the final release, it goes well, it aligns well with the figure released by our National Institute. But this is still in ex post, so I don't want to sell it too much. But just to that, this is in sample, but we have good result out of sample. That I'll show you in a while. Another nice thing is the decomposition. Basically, you can interpret the index decomposing in the series. For example, here you can see that in 2021 Q1, the index was low because debit card payments were not going very well, other consumption indexes were not going very well. So, I mean, it's pretty useful to have a narrative of business cycle, as you can see. Here, these slides is to tell, is just to test the in-sample properties of the indicator on this span. And basically, we find two things. The one that I told you right away, basically that as information accumulates over time, BET improves. And the most important month are, and basically the index, let me show you with the regression. Basically, here we regress the GDP QoQ growth rate of Italy on BET way. And you see, in the first week, we don't have predictability. This is all in sample still. You find a good signal at the end of the second month of the quarter to be nowcasted in the last month. So, but this is still in sample. These are not out of sample results. Similar result was at the monthly and quarterly level. The main takeaway is that we get a reliable nowcast of GDP 1-2 months before its release. Here also it's a pseudo out of sample exercise from 2015 Q1 till 2019 Q4. This slide is to test the goodness of predictability of the index without COVID. And we see the classical pattern of nowcast monotonicity. Basically, here we are in the first, second, third week of month 1, and the index makes mistakes, like you.
Sorry to interrupt, but there's only 1 minute left.
Perfect. So basically, from here we can see that there is forecast monotonicity. So but this is out of sample, not in sample as before. So as information comes, the index improves. And let me conclude with this slide. This is the real out of sample with all the vintage in real time. This is the forecast, the performance of our index in the COVID sample. So basically, each blue dot is the out of sample forecast of our index, the one that we will make here the 13th week of the quarter, so the ending week of the quarter, together with the GDP flash, the T+30 estimate, and the second estimate. As you can see, in Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4, and the first quarter of Q1 did a pretty good job in real time. So we were really happy about the performance of this index. And let me conclude with some further development, like we want to add weekly data, textual data. We want to do a food space model, to introduce stochastic probability, analyze density forecast, and let me conclude saying that this index could be very good for high volatile time, but also could have of some use in normal times. I conclude. Thanks for listening, and sorry for being late.
No problem. I don't think we have much time for questions. I think we should start the next next presentation in the interest of time. I will try to stop you before time, Luca, so that we have maybe 2-3 minutes.
Okay. I had a question for Simone, but I will write it in the chat.
Yes. Sorry about that.
Okay.
Otherwise, we can just take it that way. Questions in the chat, and then or after the presentation.
Yeah. I cannot share my screen, Eric.
Yeah, Luca, you have to unshare, I think, before he can share.
Sorry for that. I'll do immediately. Sorry for that.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So you see the slides?
We do.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So thank you very much for having me at the conference. This is a joint work with Sergio Consoli and Sebastiano Manzan. Sergio and myself are the European Commission, so these are our views and not the ones of the Commission, while Sebastiano is in New York. I changed a bit the title from the one that you have in agenda. Nevertheless, the work is always the same. If you want to look at the paper in the future, you can look it up under this title. So I've already been presenting last year in this conference the sentiment analysis approach that we have. So I will only briefly introduce it and then focus mostly on the forecasting exercise. In few words, what I will do today is to show you the fine-grained aspect-based sentiment indicators that we built, show how they compare to the traditional survey-based indicators from the European Commission, and then use them in a forecast and nowcast real-time exercise for the major European economies, and then results in sample and out of sample. So in few words, this is a few words about the sentiment analysis approach. In this table, I'm trying to summarize different approaches to sentiment analysis. On the y-axis, you see different ways of selecting the part of text that you are interested in, either term selection or topic modeling, while on the x-axis, you see two ways of computing a measure out of the text that you are interested in. Either you use frequency measures, like, for instance, the EPU by Baker and co-authors, or you attach a sentiment to the words. The tool that we use today goes in line with the top right entry of this table. So we do term selection and attach a sentiment to each of the words. So the sentiment analysis tool that we have is aspect-based. And by that, I mean that we are able to compute the sentiment only about a specific topic or token of interest that is specified by the user. And we do that by by using a rule-based approach. It's fine-grained, and by that I mean that we will attach a sentiment score that is in between -1 and 1 to each of the sentences that we analyze. And for that, we have a customized version of the Lower and McDonald dictionary that we specifically developed for economic applications. So moving to the data that we use to compute these sentiment indicators, we have them from the Dow Jones Data News Analytics platform. We have full text articles from 1995 to 2020. We have different categories, as you can see from Dow Jones. In total, we have approximately 27 million articles for Germany, Spain, France, Italy, and the UK. And for each of these countries, we have only the major outlets. So for instance, for the UK, we have The Economist, Daily Mail, The Guardian, and so on. Given that our approach is rule-based, it works only with the English language. And to achieve, to have that, we rely on the neural machine translation services of eTranslate within the Commission to translate everything to the English language. So we have this big set of data, and we apply our algorithm to compute some sentiment measure. Here is an example. Take this sentence that was published on the French newspaper La Tribune on September 9, 2020. The sentence in English goes like this: the French economy experiences worst recession since 1968, while Italy, and then it goes on. So I want to compute the sentiment about the topic of interest, economy, for the specific location, France. The algorithm realizes that only the first part of the sentence relates to that. It will identify a specific rule, an English rule, which is in this case that the token of interest, the French economy, is associated to a verb followed by a direct object. This is a simple rule, of course. We have combination of rules and more complex one in the algorithm. And once we have identified this rule, we can identify which words relate to the token of interest. In particular, they characterize it. And the words are experience, worst recession. We can assign a sentiment to each of these words and compute an overall sentiment of the sentence of -0.92. And here in the screenshot in black, I'm reporting the part of speech independency tagging that we obtain from spacing, which is a key element in our algorithm since it's rule-based. So we know the role played by each word within the sentence, and we know which words characterize the topic we are interested in. So this was an example. As you can see, one of the key input that the user has to specify are the specific tokens of interest, so the topics you want to compute the sentiment about. We decide to compute 6 sentiment indicators to represent different aspects of the economic activity and policy. And these are the sentiment indicators: economy, financial sector, inflation, manufacturing, monetary policy, and employment. We took the keywords associated to each of these topics relying on the World Bank ontology, which gives us a logical hierarchy among economic concepts as they are used within the World Bank documents. And then after collecting this set of keywords, examine the different frequencies of words and come up with these 6 indicators. So if we compute these 6 indicators for the different countries that we have, here is the plot that appears. So we have on the x-axis the different countries, on the y-axis the different sentiment measures. As you can see, different sentiment indicators capture different things. We have a very procyclical indicators, for instance, like the economy one or the unemployment one, which captures the 3 crises that we have in our sample for Europe. While, for instance, if you look at the financial sector indicator, it captures well the 28th crisis. For 2011, it shows a big depth, for instance, in Spain. But for instance, for the 2020 COVID-19 crisis, we see that it's quite stable. And indeed, it reflects the fact that in 2020, the financial market did not really suffer that much as the whole economy did. So these are the sentiment measures that we built, and we want to compare them with the standard survey-based confidence measures that we can obtain from the Business and Consumer Service of the European Commission. And these are the surveys that we consider. They are about different aspects of national economies: construction, industry, retail, consumer services, and the general one about economic sentiment. They are available. They started in 1985 and are published monthly after the 20th days of each month. One issue that has been identified in the literature with these type of surveys is that, first of all, they might suffer of poor timeliness. They are released only monthly, and we have seen from Simone's presentation before how important it is to have a timely indicator in COVID, for instance, was in the COVID crisis. And then they might suffer limited coverage. There are some sectors of the economy that are not represented in the survey, and the survey cannot be directly adjusted to the specific needs that a researcher or a practitioner might want to actually monitor. So to compare with the sentiment measures that we have, first of all, a simple Granger causal analysis where we compare the survey-based indicators and the news-based ones. The results are reported here using networks. Essentially, if you see a directed edge, it shows a directed Granger causal relation going from one node to the incoming node. What you see in few words is that, first of all, there are many more Granger causal relations going from sentiment measures to the surveys than the other way around. And this might say is that sentiment measure based on news have some additional predictive power than survey-based measures, so they can serve as a proxy to them. And second of all, we see that most of these outgoing Granger causal relations from news to surveys are actually coming from topics that are similar to the ones that are mapped in the surveys. So topics that are not covered within the surveys, like for instance, the status of the financial sector or monetary policy sentiment, do not show any Granger causal relations outgoing towards the surveys. And this possibly indicates the fact that some areas are not covered by the surveys, and news can complement those gaps. So let's move now to the forecasting exercise. Our goal is to predict the first release in a real-time exercise. We consider an expanding window going from 2027 to 2019. We have forecast horizons that range from 1 week before the release until 1 year. And we include all the information available in real time, considering the exact vintage. The dependent variable is GDP. We have some additional macro regressors that we will use in our forecasting exercise, and then consider the soft indicators being either the surveys or the news-based indicators that I presented above. We have, of course, mixed frequencies, and we deal with that by having an unrestricted models approach. So very simple. This equation essentially you have GDP in the dependent variable. This X is a big matrix containing lags of GDP or the additional regressors also lagged that I showed you before. And then we have this S variable, which is essentially a vector containing the soft indicators, surveys, or news-based sentiments. What we are interested in here is the estimation of these eta, essentially. We will have two models, the ARX, essentially where eta is 0. So you have the model without soft indicators, and then the proposed model that we compared against the benchmark where eta on the other end is present. For the estimation purposes, we rely on the double lasso by Belloni and co-author. And for out-of-sample assessment, the performance assessment there, we will use the multi-horizon superior predictive ability test by Quadric and co-authors. So these are results. These are the results for the in-sample exercise. So essentially what I'm reporting here is the significance of the eta parameter for the variables of interest, being the surveys or the news. I'm reporting that at different release, at different horizons, forecast horizons. So what you see is that we have the release on the x-axis, then we have the period t, which corresponds essentially to the nowcasting period. And then we have forecast made at t-1 quarter until t-4 quarters, so 1 year before the actual release of the GDP. And what you see is that both surveys indicators and sentiment measures are selected in the countries that I'm reporting here. And this is quite reassuring. So not only surveys are relevant, but also the sentiment measures that we have. And what is actually interesting is that it is important to have a wide variety of sentiments, because not always the same sentiments are collected. For instance, if you consider Germany, the unemployment sentiment measure is very useful in forecasting, while the financial sector indicator is very useful in nowcasting the German GDP. And that is also the same for France. If you look, for instance, at Spain and Italy, you will see that the monetary policy indicator is a relevant variable when forecasting GDP in those two countries. So as I said before, sentiment about surveys, about topics that are not covered by the surveys actually becomes quite important when trying to forecast and nowcast GDP. Now, if we go to the out of sample exercise, what we are reporting here essentially are the p-values of the multi-horizon superior predictability test. Think of it as a Di-Bole-Mariano, but when considering all horizons, all forecast horizons jointly. So it's quite an hard test to pass. If you pass it, it means that your forecast is doing well, better than the benchmark, jointly at many horizons. And what you see here is that both values indicate a better performance than the ARX benchmark. And we see that apart from the Spanish case, where we are pretty much always doing better than the ARX benchmark, the sentiment measures based on news are actually useful in for forecasting horizons that we are considering in this table. For instance, take the example of unemployment in Germany, or financial sector in France, or monetary policy in Italy. Lastly, let me show you this example of the last three lines, where we have essentially an average of all forecasts, either done by considering only survey-based measure, only sentiment-based measure, or all the soft indicators together. And you can see that pulling all the forecasts together, you always do better than the ARX benchmark, and this is quite comforting. And if you consider only nowcast horizons here, we have similar results. Now let's move to the COVID-19 period, where we'll make a special focus here. These are the sentiments in the first 3 quarters of 2020, and the vertical dashed line corresponds to March the 1st, 2020, so the beginning of lockdown measures in Italy, essentially. What you see is that some indicators showed a big drop, like for instance, economy, unemployment. Other indicators like financial sector did not. And if you use these indicators to make a forecast, this is what we obtain essentially. Here I'm reporting the nowcast and the forecast at different horizons, 30 days, 90 days, and 135 days. For the last quarter of 2019 and the first 3 quarters of 2020. On the x-axis, you will see the actual first release of GDP. What you can see is that actually, when considering the first quarter of 2020, we are not able to get the drop, to get the forecast going down. And despite the fact that the sentiment indicators show the degradation. And this is probably due to the fact that we are using a very simple and restricted Midas approach that was not able to capture the highly non-linear behavior of the economy in that period. Nevertheless, if we move to the second quarter and third quarter of 2020, we see that we get the correction right. We see that, as Emiliano, as Simone showed before, we have the monotonicity of the forecast. So the closer you get to the forecast, to the actual release, the closer you actually get to the forecast. And also in terms of magnitude, in certain cases, we are also getting close to the actual release of GDP. So for instance, consider the Spanish case, we are for 2020.
Luca, there's 2 minutes left.
Yes, it's okay. We also get very close to the actual release of 16%. So concluding, I showed you these economic sentiment measures that we built based on an advanced NLP technique. I showed you how they can be useful for forecasting and nowcasting, so both does. And this is quite interesting because news do not only report about past events or current events, so nowcasting issues, but also talk about future scenarios. And this is why maybe also for forecasting they can be quite useful. Most importantly, news-based indicator can complement survey-based measures. And in particular, they can cover areas that are not represented well by the surveys. So that was it. These are the references, and this working paper is not yet out, but we have other works related to these that are out, and this will soon be out. So thank you very much. Eric, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Luca. Can you unshare so that I can start? Again, I hope we can take the questions, yeah, perfect. So I guess I should start, in the interest of time, because 20 minutes is not a lot. Can you see my slides? Can, right? I hope so.
Not yet.
Not yet? Can you see them now? So, can you see them now?
We see your, yes.
Yes, perfect. Yeah, I just wanted to be sure. So this is joint work with Daniel Borup and David Rapak, and I actually noticed that we have actually presented this paper at the EC, so I hope it does not bore you if you have seen it before. The title of the paper is changing because we want to we're revising the paper currently, and we want to put a little bit more focus into our methodology. But all of the results that I show here are still relevant. That has not changed, but the title will change soon. We have a working paper out, but it will be updated. So basically, I guess it's evident here that frequent and real time indicators have proven to be very important during the COVID-19 crisis. And one of those things that made it really evident was basically the lockdown that happened around March 13, where a lot of macroeconomic series just basically, exploded, either negatively or positively, depending on what you're measuring. And we know, I know if you're part of this forum, basically that macroeconomic variables are released with a lag. So basically the information embedded in them by the time it is released, particularly in times of a lot of turmoil, is basically obsolete many times. I think we, in quiet times, we tend to forget this, but nowcasting is incredibly important in periods such as the pandemic that we are currently living, particularly the beginning when the size of the shocks was completely unknown. So most macroeconomic series are basically released at a monthly frequency, and one of the few that is released weekly is UI, which is unemployment insurance claims. Because of that, it was probably one of the most closely watched economic variables, particularly during the beginning of the crisis, although you still see it in the front of the Wall Street Journal actually recently, because it was far away from consensus expectations. Particularly at the beginning, it was incredibly important because it was the most real-time indicator we had. It's also been used by Lewis et al. As one of their most important series for constructing this weekly indicator. And although the variable is close to real time, it is actually released with a lag. And then you could say, okay, 5 to 12 days, which is the lag for this variable, is not that long. But I mean, as we saw by the focus that there was from news and media outlets on this variable, even this 5 to 12 day lag is pretty bad when shocks are this big. And we have to remember that, for example, the release on the week ending the 28th of March was basically a 30 standard deviation shock. And you can think, okay, well, is that even a stationary variable? Well, we consider stationary, but it's crazy to think about the size of this shock. Basically, the whole economy went into lockdown. Everybody was suddenly fired and looking for jobs. And predicting the size of this shock was quite important. You cannot really use other macro series to predict it because, well, they are basically, of a lower frequency and they are stale. So usually what we find is that the AR model is the best benchmark. These series are quite persistent, but in general, an AR model is a difficult benchmark to beat. And just to show you how difficult it was to predict, what I'm showing here is basically news clippings from the date in which just the week just before, just after the lockdown, where economists did not know where it would land. You had UBS predicting 860,000, whereas you had Citi predicting 4 million. So this is a few days before the release. We have to think about, the span between 4 million and 860 is much larger. I mean, the gap than the highest unemployment claims to date, which was around 800,000, which was, at the peak of the financial crisis of 2008 and 9. And you could say, well, that was only the first release, but this uncertainty actually continued for a long time. And you can see, well, actually, the number. This is basically the news clips of the following week from Business Insider. That the bank that got it closest was Goldman Sachs, but you still had a lot of uncertainty about the next release. So there's substantial uncertainty, and there is still substantial uncertainty in this series. It's quite difficult to forecast when there is so much economic turmoil. So Google Trends is an interesting series because it can capture UI seeking behavior well in advance of data release. What happened is basically a lot of people got fired. Many of them did not even know how to apply for insurance claims. So it was a long time ago since they had done it. So they started Googling when they saw that this thing was happening. So it was a really nice real-time indicator of this variable well in advance. And here we're just basically plotting Google Trends for the key terms file for unemployment or unemployment office together with initial claims, and you can clearly see that they are leading. Obviously, when you combine many of these models, or many of these terms into a complex model, you can get pretty accurate performance for out of sample nowcasts. And what we're showing here is the performance of some of our models depending on when the prediction was made. And obviously you can say, okay, here on the upper right corner we overshoot a little bit, and this is a nowcast predicted 10 days before the date of release. But as you get closer, we also get this monotonicity in terms of as we get closer to the date, the forecast performance improves, and you actually have to compare the performance of this model with what I just showed you before regarding what economists how economists were doing, right? So if they had our model at the time, they would have done much better. So what are the contributions of this paper? Well, we produce high frequency now and backcasts of UI up to 10 days before release. We achieve really large improvements in root mean square error against the autoregressive benchmark, between 24 and 61% for non-seasonally adjusted data, and between 18 and 52% for seasonally adjusted data. So those are really large improvements. We find that including daily macro and particularly financial variables, because these are mostly financial variables that are released, at a daily frequency, including them in the model does improve sometimes the forecast performance, but it's limited. Our second contribution, and this is something that we highlight much more in the new version, is that we're basically the first paper that combines the U-MIDAS framework with machine learning models, so that we're basically able to get the best of both worlds. Mixed frequency dimension allows us to capture basically the daily information flow, so you get a term structure of the information flow. And the machine learning aspects allows us to get, a very large set of predictors into one model. As you will see, we have more than 700 predictors into these models. Then we also have a section in the paper where we basically dig into interpretable machine learning and try to get interpretability out of these black box models, in particularly neural nets that can be hard to interpret, since they are almost by definition black boxes. And this allows us to get some insights into the behavior of job seekers during this crisis, and see the role of nonlinearities, right? Because we have both linear and nonlinear machine learning methods. So the target is UI. I'm not going to spend much time on this. There's some debate about the seasonality adjustment during that. That's why we use both. The predictor is, as I said, Google Trends. I think the most important thing is that in the paper, we also show a methodology to basically increase your set of predictors using only a single word. So the only term that we subjectively choose is the term unemployment. And then we just use basically tools from Google to expand this set of predictors to related terms, obviously without picking out of sample, but only using in-sample data. And then we are able to expand this to 103 unique Google term frames. This is important because you don't know which terms are going to be important, and they might vary across time. Then in terms of the information flow, well, I guess I don't really need to explain, the nowcast backcast concept to this audience. But what's interesting is basically the timing of the variables. So for example, at Monday at week T, since Google Trends is released with around 36 hours delay, we will not have data that is, up to date, up to that date, but it will be 36 hours late. So basically, the prediction that we form on Monday for that particular week, so for the UI that will be released basically 10 days after, but which pertains to that particular week, contains Google Trends data from Sunday from the week before to Saturday from the week before. So there's basically no overlap in terms of the Google Trends data and the week that you're actually trying to predict. Now, this is quite important because we find some interesting patterns in terms of that. It actually means that people Google these terms and they go and look for, they apply for unemployment insurance during that week. So basically, there is little lag behind, you Googling and actually applying, a couple of days, but usually there is not a lot of predictive information from the week before. There's a little bit, some people are starting to Google this stuff when they see that they are losing the job, but mostly what we find is that a lot of the predictive information basically pertains to that week, which is quite interesting. And obviously, this allows you to measure the information flow. So how much the information in each additional days improves the nowcast and eventually the backcasts, right? And there is obvious that we are careful about taking care that the UI, which is also released with a lag, that we don't use any forward-looking information, but we only use information that is available at that time. The general form of the predictive model is basically, your forecast for UI is going to be a function of, your lag term. We have also experimented with, using the VIC and allowing for further lags, but in general, we find actually that the AR1 model is the best model. This has something to do with the fact that the series explodes during the COVID period, and then these larger AR models tend to underperform. Then we have our Google terms and our set of parameters to estimate. Now, as I said, this is a U-MIDAS type of setting, just sort of like extended with machine learning. So basically, that means that your 103 predictors are multiplied by 7, since the variable is weekly, right? So you get one predictor per, or you basically subdivide the predictor into 7 days. So you basically end up with 7 122 predictors at a weekly frequency. The benchmark is an AR model, as I mentioned, and we consider linear machine learning models, and the two usual suspects are the lasso and the ENet. And to allow for nonlinearities, we also estimate basically neural networks or mixed frequency neural networks. So basically, these are UMIDAS versions of artificial neural networks. We consider different depths of these neural nets, 1, 2, and 3 hidden layers. The estimation period goes from 2005 to 2020. We use a 10-year rolling window. There's some details regarding the NNs, to avoid some ill-fitting models. We use real-time vintage data, so there's nothing that is forward-looking. And I think what's interesting here are the results. So you can see very large improvements. These are root mean square error ratios. So basically, every number below 1 is telling you that you're beating the benchmark model, right? And the ones marked in black are basically the best. For non-seasonally adjusted data, what you basically find is that neural nets are dominating the linear models. So the lasso and the ENet are doing fine, and the ENet is particularly the best model here for the Friday Nowcast. But in general, neural nets are outperforming the linear machine learning models. It's quite interesting because, as we will see when we compare that to the seasonally adjusted UI, it is the other way around. So there seems to be the case that that nonlinearities matter for these nonlinear models. Would also like to say that here I'm only showing AR, but actually this AR is obviously augmented with seasonal dummies, and we tried several specifications that allow for seasonality, but the machine learning models with Google always beat these benchmarks. So it's a bit interesting. It seems that for seasonally adjusted data, linear models are capturing what they need to capture, and they are the best performance. But when it comes to non-seasonal data, non-linearities seem to matter. So a lot of I'm going to jump very fast to these slides, and a lot of the predictability or the gains from the models basically come from the crisis period. This is sort of expected. You have huge shocks, and you could be a little bit critical. I mean, we are overperforming the benchmark in the period before the crisis, but just a little bit. During the crisis, this is where these models shine. But that is particularly when you want a model that performs good, right? Because these are the periods that are very hard to forecast. I'm gonna jump through. We have a whole exercise about statistical significance, where we make it conditional on some variables. But in general, our results, you see, they are very strong. So they are obviously going to be statistically significant. So I'm just going to jump through that. I think one thing that is very interesting, though, is so interpretability. So what we're doing here is using variable importance measure based on PDPs. Not going to go so much into details, but you can read it in the paper. And what we find is that basically before the crisis, both linear and nonlinear models are assigning large importance to the lag, to basically the lag coefficient of UI, so the autoregressive structure. And that actually continues to happen, for example, for the Monday Nowcast, during the COVID crisis. So the lag is still important for Monday, but remember, Monday Nowcast is the only model where there is no overlap between the data from Google. So basically, the data that we use in this model is from the week before. As soon as there starts to be some data that pertains to the week that you are nowcasting, even if it's one day, then basically the variable importance for the lag disappears. So we think that this is quite interesting, because it's basically like, okay, there is a lot of information in the autoregressive term, but as soon as you are in the crisis, and there is an overlap between the week that you're trying to forecast and the information and the timing where these Google searches were made, then basically the lag structure completely disappears. This is quite interesting for a variable that has an autoregressive coefficient of like 0.98. It's an incredibly persistent variable. You sort of get the same picture when you think about non-seasonally adjusted models and neural nets, but they are obviously much less sparse, these neural net models. So they basically assign a lower weight relatively to many more variables, but the overall picture is the same. The AR term basically completely disappears during the crisis, and it stops being important. Another thing that I would like to highlight before I conclude, since I only have 2 minutes, is basically this day of the week effects, because you can actually decompose again, the predictability in terms of variable importance into what days are the most important. So in which days is there the most information? And the interesting thing is that prior to the COVID crisis, we basically don't find a strong pattern. So it's like all days are, almost equally important, or at least there is no strong pattern, which would basically tell you that using, for example, a lag polynomial as the MIDAS models tend to do would work pretty well. The interesting thing is that as soon as the COVID crisis starts, then you tend to assign a very large weight to the last day that is available. That basically tells you that this mixed frequency machine learning models, as we're calling it in the new version of the paper, where you estimate a U-MIDAS model, but you allow the weights to be completely flexible through machine learning methodologies, are going to be outperforming a MIDAS method by a lot, because you give it a lot more freedom, and you let basically the model choose the most important thing. So I can see I only have 1 minute left. So as a concluding remark, we show again that daily frequency of internet search volume can create highly accurate and timely macroeconomic indicators. We introduce machine learning-based U-MIDAS models, which exploit this without any pre-selection. So again, I think we like to claim that we have big data in macro, but once you get beyond this 700 predictors, then we really are talking about big data, at least from a macroeconomic perspective. And then we show that nonlinearities matter for non-seasonally adjusted series, but overall linear models seem to perform pretty well. Thank you. So I guess I finished exactly on time, and I guess we will take the questions on a private session. But thanks a lot. It was a really good session, and I hope to see you in other sessions. Bye.
Thank you, Eric.
Thanks a lot. The session is closing.
Yeah, well, I guess I mean, I don't know if it will.
Are you going in another
close.
session? Are you going in another session, or we can chat a bit?
I mean, we can chat a bit. I mean, I'm not closing it, but I would worry. I mean, we can chat. I would worry if they will close it. But I don't think they will, right? So I mean, we can chat definitely.
Yeah, I don't know whether they have another session coming up on this slot, and they might.
I think yeah. Okay. Sorry for being late.
Thank you.
No.
Thank you for the answer, Simone. It was quite clear from your.
No, thanks for the question. Actually, yeah, there is a lot of fluctuation in the classical one. Actually, I mean, looking at the fluctuation, like you have some January is very high, some January is very low. I mean, like there is not very a seasonal pattern on the fluctuation. It's just that it's much noise. It has much more noise with a static PCA. Instead, in the other variation version, you have an autoregressive structure factor, and that's in smoothing the signal. Anyway, great. Both your paper are really interesting. Are great. I mean, the one of is very nice. It's a very nice paper, and also yours with graph. It's very interesting. Actually, I met Daniel in an online conference in December.
Okay, so he was probably presenting this paper.
We have a chat on the paper. Yeah. No,
we're presenting another paper soon at the EC. This is a bit interesting because we're looking at digging very deep into this interpretable machine learning type of methods, and I think we have some interesting findings there. I think
this is the third time I'm seeing this presentation.
It
gets better and better, huh? I'm looking forward for the next one.
I mean, we're working on other papers, obviously, but this one was like until you submit finally, and now we got some referee comments where we want to like basically reframe the paper. So I just thought, okay, I'm just gonna present it. But I mean, I think it was really hot last year, when everything was happening, and now it's just like, okay, but we're rewriting it. But now, I mean, I'm looking forward to presenting the other paper, which actually it will be me, and that is a bit more general, and we hope to introduce a lot of this. So basically, dig very deep into how to measure this, how to explain these black box models. So, and I guess you guys are also working with some ML methods. So
explainability is a key issue. And when is the next presentation? I mean, when is this presentation?
I think it's in October. So, and I mean, I would like to see you still don't have a working paper on this paper, right? That you're working on.
Not yet. It will soon be out. We have two other ones that present more the methodology. This one on Europe. It will soon be out. Yeah, definitely. Well, when you have a working version, I don't know if I would actually like to. Yeah, I mean, if you can email me, that would be nice, and you'll probably forget it. But
I mean, look, if you have, I would be really actually. Yuri, my code, you talked a little bit with Yuri for the, I mean, like, if, when you have it ready, if you can email me, me too, I put.
No, same thing. I was reading your work lately, I mean, with Yuri and all your co-authors at the Bank of Italy, so it's, I'm keeping also an update on your work there.
How far are you guys located geographically? I mean, you're both in Italy, right?
Yeah.
Okay, and do you go to each other presentations? I mean, or there is not such close collaboration in general between the EC and the Bank of Italy?
I'm in the north, close to Switzerland. Where are you in?
Copenhagen. Are you in Copenhagen now?
No, I am in Aarhus, which is the second biggest city.
In Aarhus. Okay, Aarhus. Okay. Soren Johansen, the capital of econometrics. Yeah. Okay,
Okay, guys, then let's keep in touch and let's see around for the next round of presentations.
Yes. Guys, see you. It was a pleasure to hear from you. Great works.
Okay.
Thanks a lot.